On July 8th, 2026, Colorado State University issued their forecast for the 2026 hurricane season, with their numbers reaching near historical lows. In this forecast, they were calling for only 9 named storms, 4 hurricanes, and 1 major hurricane, lows we had not seen since 2014. This is coupled due to a strong El Nino reaching near historic levels, and wind shear being the primary factors for that. So for many, looking at this at the surface value, you would think the 2026 hurricane season is dead, and there's not much that's going to be talked about. But here is where you are wrong. Because while 2026 may not be as active as what we were thinking about earlier in the season, mainly due to a historic El Nino potential, what that could lay the groundwork for could be something way worse than imagined. 2027's hurricane season, based on future projections, could be a very bad season. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about why a very quiet 2026 is a worst case scenario. "2023 was the last El Nino that we had, and that El Nino was actually a really strong one, peaking at around 2 degrees Celsius above the climatological average in the ENSO region. On paper, that would have killed the hurricane season. On paper, that would have ended things right then and there for a lot of people. It would have weakened the wind shear, strengthened the trade winds. Not too much activity would have gone on. But there was something interesting that ended up happening. Let's go ahead and pull this up for you guys right here. This is what I wanted to show you. This is the water temperature map as of August 30th, 2023. As you guys can notice right here, based on on what you're seeing on the surface, these are extremely warm waters. Up to this point, the water temperature across much of the Atlantic at this point was reaching historical highs. We can also look at the climate reanalyzer as well. This is when it peaked on August 30th. We were at an average temperature of about 25.4 degrees Celsius. That's about 77.7 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you who do not use the metric system. These were historically high water temperatures, and the reason I bring this up was because a lot of the water anomalies, especially in the subtropical Atlantic, were reaching areas exceeding 7 degrees Celsius above average. Those extreme anomalies there and across much of the Atlantic were what ultimately ended up crushing the El Nino underneath its weight. And that's why in 2023 we had an active hurricane season. That's why we saw Hurricane Idalia, Hurricane Lee, Tammy, and a few other infamous storms from that area. However, what followed 2023's El Nino was a extremely big situation, and I want to go ahead and show you the ocean heat content to kind of explain further what I mean by this. And as we go ahead, this is where we were on September 3rd, 2023 over here. As you can see, there was an insane amount of ocean heat content in the Caribbean, off the coast of the Bahamas, and in the Gulf region, in particular the Loop Current. The reason I'm honing in on this especially is because in 2023, El Nino was still affecting the hurricane season, not in terms of activity, but in terms of track. Whenever El Nino hurricane seasons do occur, they typically keep systems far away from land. Hurricane Lee moved north of the Lesser Antilles, stayed out to sea until it hit Canada and Maine. Idalia was the only exception because it formed in the Central American Gyre. But then what we started to see throughout much of the later months of 2023 was something peculiar. This part of the Caribbean, there were no named storms outside of Idalia, especially in the eastern and central Caribbean, staying out of the extremely high ocean heat content that was building up in that area. And by the time we got to December, things really started to show. This part of the Caribbean remained very untapped going into 2024. And ultimately, that coupled with a strong shift from El Nino to La Nina ultimately resulted in a very active hurricane season. We had Hurricane Beryl, that barreled through the Caribbean, and part of the reason it maintained its intensity is because of this ocean heat content. The ocean heat content that got left behind in 2023 due to the El Nino ended up carrying over into 2024, which is why we started seeing very historic starts to it. This is June 1st, 2024. Taking a look at this, the loop current is really warming up in terms of its ocean heat content and water temperature. OHC already close to cracking 150 over in that region, and in parts off the coast of Jamaica, you were seeing a 175 bubble over here, as well as seeing a 150 popping up off the coast of Puerto Rico. You don't typically see this in June. You typically see this in around August or September. And the reason I keep harping up on this is kind of the nature of what tropical cyclones typically do. What they end up doing is they're kind of a natural coolant, if I may. What I mean by that is their purpose is to cool down the ocean heat and the water temperatures across the ocean. Yes, hurricanes can form in very warm water, but the amount of upwelling those tropical systems end up doing ends up bringing a lot of cooler water and kind of helping balance out a lot of the very warm waters in the tropics. That's why when you see Category 5 hurricanes, you see a huge cold wake behind it, because what they end up doing is just cooling the water around it, whether it's bringing colder air or precipitating over the warm water onto the surface of the ocean. But overall, you didn't see that in the Caribbean, and what you started off with in June of that year was a massive amount of ocean heat content already tapped up, already stored in the gas tank over here that remained very much untapped from 2023. And by the time we got to the end of June 2024, let's go ahead and go to June 28th right here. Things were starting to get a lot more interesting as we pull this up. Here's what we had on June 28th. You had a lot of OHC, not necessarily the strong 175 pocket we saw previously, but the OHC that was in the Caribbean greatly expanded. It made it a lot easier for this to expand and encompass the entire basin compared to the concentrated Northwest Caribbean area we would typically see in a hurricane season at that point. This right here is what greatly contributed to why Hurricane Beryl was as strong as it was. This ocean heat content map is why Hurricane Beryl became the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record. Had 2023 had any system really tapped into the Caribbean ocean heat content in 2023, it is, in my opinion, likely that we would not have seen Hurricane Beryl. Granted, there were a huge combination of factors that made Beryl the powerhouse that it did. You had low wind shear across the entire Caribbean until it reached Jamaica. You had a good amount of moist air before a Sahara air plume moved into much of the main development region. It was literally the perfect combination of conditions that allowed for Beryl to occur. But in my opinion, the intensity would not have been as powerful had the ocean heat content been lower, and had we not seen this carryover effect from 2023. And that's the kind of the main point I'm harping on to this at this point, because this only gets worse. By the time we get to, I believe it's August or September of 2024, let's go ahead and pull up a map about this. This is late August, the 28th. Look at this, ladies and gentlemen. Oh my goodness. You're looking at 175 OHC across an entire area from the Yucatan Peninsula all the way through Jamaica and all the way to Hispaniola. This is something you don't typically see, ladies and gentlemen. And I know I've been spending a lot of time talking about 2023 to 2024, but the reason for that is the pattern I'm noticing here is eerily similar, except it's not just concentrated in the Caribbean, it's more so Atlantic-wide. Let me go ahead and show you what I'm talking about. Here is our water temperatures as of right now. It's still July at the time I'm recording this. The water temperatures are still going to heat up. They are very much heating up at this current point in time. But if we take a look at what we're seeing across the entire Gulf, we're looking at 30 to 31 degrees Celsius. Those are typically going to fluctuate up and down, especially as winter weather season starts to move across much of the United States. Those water temperatures might be cooling. But in other areas like the main development region and in parts of the Atlantic Basin, particularly in the tropical regions over here off the coast of Florida, off the coast of the Lesser Antilles, those don't typically cool down. Fronts do not typically go down to that area in the world. And what ends up happening right here is if this remains untapped and if this continues to persist into 2027, you're going to have a situation where the insane water temperatures that we're seeing right now are only going to increase and get much higher going into the next year. And a lot of climatological models are picking up on this as well. This isn't just SST temperatures and analysis on that. This is also like a whole conglomerate of things as well. Also want to take a look at the climate reanalyzer as well. This is where we were in 2023. 2026 is not up to that level at this point. It's currently just above what we were seeing in 2025 with those water temperatures. But the caveat with that is these water temperatures are past last year's with the fact that they are more concentrated in the tropics. Until just recently, we didn't see much warm water in much of the subtropical Atlantic. That changed when the heat wave impacted much of the eastern U.S., But overall, based on what I'm seeing right here, things are getting interesting, and you're still seeing at least relatively above average sea surface temperature anomalies, not nearly as big as what the El Nino was showing, which is why we're seeing such a quiet season, because of a combination of a rather historic potential for a big El Nino this year, as well as the fact that the water temperatures in the Atlantic aren't nearly as warm as where they were in 2023 at this current point, are why you're seeing an active season. But a lot of these water temperatures, and especially these anomalies, are going to persist, especially if they remain concentrated in the tropics. Because what ultimately is going to happen here is, if we are only going to see single-digit named storms and not very many major hurricanes from this, you're going to see a situation where things really start to ramp up for 2027. Come springtime 2027, you're going to see those water temperatures start to heat up again, and already you're going to have a pretty good base as to what may be happening, similar to what we saw in 2024, ladies and gentlemen. So based on water temperature anomalies alone, that is a very big concern of mine. But there's also another factor that we need to talk about as well. This right here, ladies and gentlemen, is the CANSIPS model. I talked about this in my El Nino video. We're going to be talking about this once again. So this is another factor that we're going to be paying attention to across here, because this is going to be a very big climatological tool as to what may be happening going into next year. We have our El Nino set up across much of the tropics, across much of the ENSO region. It only continues to ramp up as we get towards October and November, peaking around November, I believe, according to the CANSIPS, across much of the regions over here. And then as time continues to go on, as we get to December, it does start to weaken slightly, particularly in regions 1 and 2 over here off the coast of South America and around the Galapagos Islands over here. But what you're going to notice in the Atlantic is you're not noticing much cooling going on, at least in terms of the anomalies. Yes, the areas in the Gulf are definitely going to cool off because of the frontal boundaries that are going to be attached to it, and because it's going to be winter time. But areas, say, in the Caribbean, the Southern Atlantic Basin, and the main development region, you're not going to see that much cooling based off of that, and those warm anomalies are only going to persist going forward. As we start getting into the new year, you do see a little bit of cooling over here in this part of the Gulf. Here, let me go ahead and see if I can zoom in on this real quickly. You do see a little bit of cooling going on in the Gulf region over here, but overall across much of the Atlantic, you're not seeing too much. But you are seeing a lot of cooling going on in this part of the subtropical Atlantic over here. That also is going to be a bit of a concern for me, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But overall, the deep tropics remain very warm, and as we go into March and April, those only continue to ramp up and only continue to heat up across much of the area. By the time we get to June 2027, the CANCIPS is forecasting much of the Atlantic to really start heating up, and those above average anomalies really return. The strongest areas are actually in the southern Caribbean off the coast of South America and in areas in the Atlantic basin over here, although the Gulf and the northwestern Caribbean aren't too far behind. But there's also something we need to take a look at in terms of our global sector. Take a look at this area. We highlighted it in the El Nino video, but what you're going to be seeing from what I have looked at is the El Nino is not going to last into 2027. What we're looking at, according to some of these models, is for this system to end up collapsing. The El Nino is forecast, especially starting in early to mid 2027, starting around, I'd say, March 2027. You're going to start shifting from a very strong El Nino to a potential La Nina setup by the time we get into peak hurricane season. So given some of the anomalies that we have seen, and especially that are forecasted, with some estimates ranging across the entire region anywhere from about 2.5 to 3.5 degrees Celsius above average, that would make it one of the most violent swings, and from El Nino to negative neutral or La Nina in the ENSO's forecasted history. Not even 2015 or 1997 was that violent. In 2023, we noticed something similar with this. Let's go ahead and pull this up. So here is our chart that we have. This was going into 2024. We're going to go ahead and update this. We're going to go ahead and update this chart for you guys right here, and we'll go ahead and pull this up. Here's what we had going into 2023. You had a moderately strong La Nina going into 2022. Going into 2023, you had the temperatures flip, surging into El Nino territory. But by the time peaking around December of 2023 is when they reached that 2 degrees Celsius threshold I was talking about earlier. But then you started noticing something. You didn't necessarily notice it at first, but especially in the first month, those temperatures started to collapse. And when I mean collapse, they collapsed at a very historic rate. This is where we were in 97, 98. They definitely fell apart too, but they didn't. But it took a little bit of a longer time for it to fall apart. Same thing in 2015. Yes, it did fall into La Nina territory. Then it boosted back to positive Nino, and then so on and so forth. But in 2023, this collapse in the span of 2 months, the El Nino strength was cut in half. And by the time we got into April of 2024, we were out of El Nino territory. We were now in a positive neutral phase, and that continued to persist. And then going into the hurricane season, we actually flipped into negative neutral to La Nina territory as well. 2026 looks to be a similar situation to 2023, if not more rapid, especially after April 2027. And the reason I bring this up, and the reason I'm looking at these charts right here, is to kind of see what the pattern is like. 1997, for example, you had a pretty strong El Nino, then it started to fall apart. It took about, I'd say, about 6 months for it to get back to La Nina territory. As we got to 2015, it persisted for a while, took a while to get back to negative neutral to weak La Nina. Then it bounced back up and down, and then oscillated for a little while, and so on and so forth. 2023, it surged, and then it collapsed in the span of about 5 to 6 months. 2026 looks to be similar, and because of the forecasted surge in temperature, potentially eclipsing 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius above average across the entire ENSO region, that is going to be a very violent swing and a very concerning thing to look at going forward. Because if we go from strong El Nino in February 2027 to collapsed to negative neutral by June 2027, that is going to be a very big concern on itself. And on top of that, we also need to look at our moisture anomalies as well. Because what we're seeing too, especially going into May and June 2027, you're noticing a lot more moisture, especially in the main development region, the Caribbean, and the Southern Atlantic Basin, where all those water temperatures are going to be untapped. That is also going to be a problem right here. Yes, Sahara air layer is going to exist, but you're looking at for next year a far more moist environment as well. And with the weakening El Nino, trade winds are going to crash down as well. They're going to crash harder than the stock market. And then at that point, your wind shear values also start plummeting with those trade winds. So overall, you're looking at a combination of things all happening at once, it seems, starting around April of 2027, based on the early climatological models that I am seeing. We have the extremely warm water temperatures, you have wind shear starting to plummet, and now you have an insanely more moist atmosphere, especially in the Caribbean. Look at the Caribbean. You're looking at a lot more precipitable water. We're going to go ahead and zoom in on this for you guys over here. This is our precipitable water that we are showing for you guys. This is, I'd say, a good up to 6 to 8 inches above the climatological mean right here. That is a very large anomaly. And these are all in areas where the water temperatures are going to remain untapped. And if we see a situation where this hurricane season in 2026 doesn't really produce too much in terms of the Atlantic, this is going to be very problematic going into next year. That said, there are a couple of caveats that I do want to highlight right here that will make things a little dicey, at least a little bit. Not too much, but a little bit. Here's what we have for our SST anomalies. We have something developing going on across parts of the Atlantic over here, off the coast of Africa, starting around April and persisting into June. You're noticing the water temperatures over here switching from warm to cold. That is known as the Atlantic Nina. The Atlantic Nina is kind of like El Nino, La Nina, where water temperatures over there oscillate to warmer or cooler than average. Unlike the ENSO region, where an El Nino forecasts a lower hurricane season in the Atlantic, and La Nina forecasts a higher than average hurricane season, La Nina and the Atlantic is a little bit flipped. What you notice with this is, at least for the Atlantic Nina, you're going to see a situation where that does end up maybe chipping away a little bit at the amount of storms, due to the fact that that region right there is cooler than average. It oscillates, and it kind of affects some of the trade winds that we're dealing with. The main thing we need to watch out for at this current point is okay. You're seeing this big collapse over here with the El Nino, but you're also seeing a bit of a collapse in the temperatures with the Atlantic Nina going on right here. Which one is going to be more dominant? If the La Nina in the Eastern Pacific becomes the more dominant factor compared to the Atlantic Nina, it's not going to make too much of a difference, especially going into peak hurricane season. If the Atlantic Nina is delayed or cut down in the months to come on the forecasts, then it's not going to make much of a difference. The only way that, in my opinion, that the Atlantic Nina could have a big impact on tropical activity is if it absolutely continues to not only cool down, but cool down at a very fast rate, faster than what the ENSO region is doing in the Pacific. It would have to kind of outpace what's going on over there. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, but overall, that's the situation we're paying attention to. You're also going to need to take into account our stability problems as potential as well, because yes, you are seeing a lot of above average anomalies across much of the Atlantic over here. You're definitely seeing those right there, and especially also noticing too off the coast of Maine, off the coast of New England, much colder anomalies than average as well. The main thing I'm worried about is this area in the northern tropics / southern subtropics. Is that going to be a rather gradual decrease in the water temperatures, or is it going to be like this year where there's a lot more of a gradient? 2025, part of the reason we had our hurricane season not as active as forecast was because of stability problems. And some of those stability problems came from the fact that we had a lot of warm water, but it was very widespread across much of from the tropics all the way to the deep into the subtropical Atlantic. I mean, looking at the spread of it, you were looking at anywhere from 28 to 29 degrees Celsius water temperatures, not just in the tropics, but also about 40 degrees north as well. So that's also going to be a factor that we're going to want to pay attention to. That said, this cold anomaly in the Gulf of Maine over here is going to be interesting as well, and the fact that this situation, at least according to this map, would create a gradient strong enough to really not make too much of a difference in it. And what I mean by that is the stability problems that we saw in 2025, most likely, at least according to this map, would not persist, mainly due to the crushing cold anomalies that we are dealing with across Newfoundland, across the New England, and across parts of the coasts over here off the coast of the New England and Canada. So it's kind of a jack of all trades that I'm noticing with this right here. But overall, the main trend I've seen is very concerning and, dare I say, disturbing, due to the fact that you're not going to see these water temperatures untapped, and the fact that we're going from an El Nino to a La Nina at a rather violent pace is very concerning to me. Obviously, there's a lot more factors into this, but it's mainly a quick breakdown as to why 2027 has a much higher potential for it to be a very active hurricane season. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. Join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.